Welcome to Miyconst Hardware. I had to make a small revolution in my room, thus my current recording abilities are rather limited. Still, in this video I'm going to compare one of the most attractive Xeon E5 CPUs, which is Xeon E5-2640 V3. Right now this CPU can be bought on AliExpress for just 25 euros. Pretty often people are texting to me and saying that first I plan to buy a cheap Xeon E5-2620 or 2640 V3, and later on I want to upgrade to the 12-core i5-2690 or i5-2680 V3. Thus I would like to have a good expensive X99 motherboard which could withstand or hold the 12-core Xeon E5 CPUs. So in this video I'm going to compare i5-2640 V3 against i5-2690 V3, and we will see if it is worth it to upgrade from 2640 V3 to 2690 V3. To make this video even more interesting, I'm going to add Core i5-10400F results, but first a few technical details. Core i5-10400F, this one has 6 cores, 12 threads, so CPU core frequency is up to 4.3 GHz on single core. In games, the core clock frequency is 3.9 to 4.1 GHz, depends on the load. The CPU was tested on MSI Z590A Pro motherboard, and the memory speed was DDR4-3466. It's important to mention that even the cheapest B560 motherboard is able to overclock memory, thus there is no reason to limit memory speed to DDR4-2666. The next one, Xeon E5-2690 V3, this one has 12 cores, 24 threads, and the CPU clock frequency goes up to 3.5 GHz on all cores in games if you implement Turbo Boost unlock procedure. The CPU was tested on Tinsha X99 D8 motherboard, the memory speed was at the maximum possible DDR4-2133 CL11. In the previous test, you have seen that gaming performance of E5-2690 V3 is very close to Core i5-10400F, but the price is also very similar. Thus, it would be very interesting to compare these CPUs to E5-2640 V3, which is the hero of today's video. The CPU has 8 cores, 16 threads, and the CPU clock frequency is 3.4 GHz on all cores when implementing Turbo Boost Unlock. Unfortunately, the memory speed is limited to DDR4-1866, and my memory modules refuse to work at DDR4-1866 CL10, so the memory speed was DDR4-1866 CL11, but with a slightly slower clock speed I was able to tighten the secondary memory timings a bit more compared to DDR4-2133 with E5-2690 V3. This is not going to do a big difference, but it is still some help 2640 V3 to catch up with E5-2690 V3. As I have already said, i5-2640 V3 can now be bought on AliExpress, and unlike 12-core i5-2690 V3, this one does not require an expensive motherboard. You can slap it onto a cheap X99 RS9 motherboard and use the dirty cheap DDR4 memory with as low as possible clock. You also don't need expensive cooler because the CPU is not as hot. Thus, it seems to be a very attractive and interesting option, but as always, make sure that you have good airflow in your chassis to prevent overheating, because even with E5-2640 V3, VRM may overheat and burn out. Let's move into the test results. As usual, I have done all tests 3 times and reporting here average values. All the games were tested at 1080p screen resolution, and for the graphics card, I am using my AMD RX 6800 XT. Let's get started. Battlefield 5. Here, E5-2690 is about 15 FPS faster than E5-2640 by average FPS, but somehow E5-2640 is about 5 FPS faster by 1% lows. With E5-2690 we are getting 1549 FPS, 2640 delivers 55 and 133 FPS. The 1% load difference can be explained with the tighter secondary timings with E5-2640 where I use DDR4-1866, or it could be due to different core topology inside the CPUs. E5-2640 has just 8 cores and E5-2690 has 12 cores. The core-to-core communication is implemented differently. Red Dead Redemption 2. It is a very GPU-demanding game, and here both of the Xeons are delivering almost identical performance. E5-2690 gives us 31 and 116 FPS, with E5-2640 we are getting 31 and 114 FPS. GTA 5. In this game I also see the same phenomena when the average FPS is slightly better with E5-2690 and the minimal FPS is slightly better with E5-2640. In this case, i5-2690 delivers 49 and 147 FPS, 2640 gives 55 and 135 FPS. Again, average FPS is about 15 FPS better with the 2690, minimal FPS is about 5 FPS better with 2640. Far Cry New Dawn, a typical single-core game where i5-2640 V3 loses about 5 to 10 FPS compared to i5-2690 V3. 2690 delivers 60 and 83 FPS, while 2640 is slightly lower, 54-76 FPS. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, yet another unoptimized game which stutters with any CPU. i5-2690 gives 24 and 63 FPS, 2640 gives us 23 and 60 FPS. The difference between the two Xeons is just a few FPS. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a rather optimized game, it knows how to utilize all or at least many CPU cores. Here both of the Xeons are delivering identical performance. 2690 gives 76 and 118 FPS, with i5-2640 I have got 73 and 119 FPS. The 1 FPS difference in favor of i5-2640 V3 can be explained with basically anything. Watch Dogs Legion. Even though this game has very similar optimization to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, here CPU demands are slightly higher. i5-2640 V3 is not able to match i5-2690 V3. The gap is about 15 FPS. 2690 delivers 72 and 101 FPS, while 2640 gives only 61 and 85 FPS. Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege. Even though i5-2640 V3 renders more than 270 FPS at all times, it is still not able to match i5-2690 V3. 2690 delivers 318 and 386 FPS, while i5-2640 is only capable of 278 and 313 FPS. Anno 1800. The game benchmark does not provide minimal FPS values, but we are getting average FPS in different benchmark section. Thus, I am picking minimal average value as well as the overall average value. Here, i5-2640 is about 10 to 15 FPS slower than i5-2690. 2690 gives 131 and 149 FPS, while 2640 is capable of 124 and 135 FPS. Immortal Fenyx Rising. One more game with no optimization. Here, both of the Xeons are delivering basically identical performance. 2690 gives 16 and 64 FPS, 2640 gives 16 and 61 FPS. Thus, the difference between the Xeons is just a few FPS. F1 2021. i5-2690 is able to render more than 200 FPS at all times, but i5-2640 V3 lags behind by about 40 FPS. 2690 gives 209 and 267 FPS, while 2640 is only capable of 184 and 226 FPS. In Forza Horizon 4, the gap between the Xeon CPUs is slightly smaller, it's about 15 FPS. 2690 delivers 152 and 175 FPS, while 2640 delivers 136 and 161 FPS. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. In this game, both of the Xeons are not able to match Core i5's performance, but i5-2640 is further behind i5-2690. 2690 gives us 79 and 127 FPS, while 2640 delivers 72 and 115 FPS. Total War 3 Kingdoms. In this game, both of the Xeons are demonstrating almost identical performance. 2690 gives 93 and 119 FPS, 2640, 91 and 115 FPS. Once again, the difference between two Xeons is just a few FPS. Horizon Zero Dawn. This CPU-demanding game is able to load multiple CPU cores, and here 2640 lags behind 2690 by about 10 FPS. 2690 renders 70 and 142 FPS, while 2640 delivers 63 and 132 FPS. Hitman 2, another CPU-intensive game, but unfortunately, as I have told in the last video, something happened with my video capture card and I do not have a benchmark run for i5-2690 V3. Thus, take a look at the graph instead. Here, 2690 delivers 41 and 119 FPS, 2640 is slightly slower, 37 and 110 FPS. Overall, the performance is very similar, but 2690 is slightly faster. Metro Exodus. One more game where the gap between the Xeon CPUs is less than 10 FPS. 2690 delivers 67 and 117 FPS, 2640 gives us 62 and 109 FPS. Age of Empires Definitive Edition. This game does not have any sorts of optimization. Both of the CPUs have horrible but identical performance, about 18 and 45 FPS. DCS World or Digital Combat Simulator. This game is also not well optimized, but here i5-2690 is about 15 FPS faster than i5-2640. 2690 renders 59 and 142 FPS, while 2640 gives us 53 and 127 FPS. Gears 5 is another example where the gap between the two Xeons is just a few FPS. 2690 gives us 6224 FPS, while 2640 is just slightly slower, 61 and 119 FPS. Combining all 20 games together, we're getting the following. E5-2640 V3 on average is just 13 FPS slower than E5-2690 V3. E5-2690 delivers 84 and 138 FPS, while 2640 is slightly slower, 77 and 125 FPS. These benchmarks were concluded with the 1080p screen resolution and AMD RX 6800 XT graphics card. This is one of the most powerful graphics cards on the market, and most of you who are using E5-2640 or E5-2690 V3 are probably going to pair it with the slower graphics cards. In such configuration, the gap between 2640 V3 and 2690 V3 will be even smaller. Now it's time to take a look at the power consumption. For this test I'm using Assassin's Creed Valhalla benchmark as usual. Entire system with E5-2690 V3 consumed about 360 FPS. The system with E5-2640 V3 consumed about 330 FPS. 4 additional cores of E5-2690 V3 also require additional power, thus the system with E5-2690 V3 consumes extra 30 watts of electricity. The same as in the previous benchmarks, I have also tested Final Fantasy VII and Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Final Fantasy benchmark does not provide FPS values, instead we are getting loading time and overall score. Here, E5-2690 consumed 18 seconds to load benchmark scenes and scored about 20,000 points. E5-2640 V3 spent 19 seconds to load the scenes and scored only 18,000 points. Using MSI Afterburner, we can take a look at the FPS values during the benchmark, and here we can see that E5-2640 V3 is often up to 30 FPS slower than E5-2690 V3. With the latest updates, Call of Duty Modern Warfare is no longer compatible with MSI Afterburner. The game also does not have a built-in benchmark, thus I have to use internal FPS counter. According to this in-game FPS counter, E5-2690 V3 is about 10 to 40 FPS faster than E5-2640 V3. So, what can I say in the conclusion? Even though E5-2690 V3 is a very attractive and interesting CPU, with its 12 cores it gives us about Core i5-10400F gaming performance. Unfortunately, the CPU price is also very similar to Core i5-10400F, and you don't really gain much. Especially if you have to pay extra VAT taxes on AliExpress packages, it makes much more sense to buy a new platform with Core i5-10400F. On the other hand, the Xeon E5-2640 V3 seems to be a much more attractive option. It costs just 25 euros on AliExpress at the moment. You can install it onto cheapest X99 motherboards such as X99 RS9 from Machinist. You can also use the cheapest DDR4 memory, and some very simple, very basic CPU cooler would do the job for you. Of course, you always need to check your second-hand market. You need to check how much you would have to pay to assemble a Core i5 or Core i3 system. You also need to keep in mind the VAT taxes, but in general it seems to be a very nice starting combo to build your gaming computer. Of course, as always, I strongly recommend you to check your temperatures and make sure that you have good airflow in your chassis, because even 8-core E5-2640 V3 Turbo Boost unlocked to 3.4 GHz on all CPU cores may cause some issues to the cheapest X99 motherboards from China. The VRM there is simply not that great and it may overheat and burn out. Other than that, that's probably all I can tell about E5-2640 V3. I hope this video was interesting, I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, goodbye!